I'm Maya, 32 years old, a ceramicist, and I was standing in the new community studio I'd spent 3 years building from a derelict warehouse. My hands, stained with clay, were finally clean. I'd just finished lighting the candles on the long oak table, ready for the grand opening dinner, ready for my family. That's when my phone buzzed, a text from my mom, Helen, the night before the event. "We'll skip it. Your sister just moved too." No call, no apology, just a casual deletion. My jaw locked until it ached. I looked at the 15 empty chairs, each one set perfectly. For a second, the smell of curing plaster and wood polish felt like a tomb. So, I smiled. A small, cold smile, just for myself. I walked the length of the table and blew out every candle, one by one. Then I locked the front door on a dinner that would never happen. A week later, while that same studio was glowing on the cover of a local lifestyle magazine, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Missed calls stacked one on top of the other, all from them. And trust me, that magazine feature was only the first wave. Before I tell you what came next, tell me, have you ever been quietly erased by your own family? To understand that text, you have to understand the map of my family. It wasn't complicated. There was Sarah, and then there was me. When I was 8, Christmas morning always started with 2 sounds. The sharp click 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 of my mother's heels on the tile floor and the oven timer buzzing for the cinnamon rolls. I'd come downstairs, and Sarah, my younger sister, would already be there. She'd be sitting in the center of the living room, a halo of tinsel in her hair, smiling like the morning light was made just for her. "There she is," Mom would say, and her voice was always softer when she spoke to Sarah. She'd hand her a box. Not just any box. It was always the biggest one. Wrapped in glittering gold paper with a ribbon so perfect it looked fake. "Open yours, sweetheart." I'd sit on the floor, my knees pulled to my chest, and wait. My box was always on the side, smaller, wrapped in the cartoon Santa paper. I opened it. Inside, gray wool socks, a 3-pack of blue-lined notebooks. My mother, Helen, would lean over, patting my head. "You like writing things down," she'd say, as if she'd read my mind. But it wasn't a question, and it wasn't a gift. It was a label. I was the practical one, the one who recorded things, not the one who did things worth recording. Sarah got a doll that spoke. I got the tools to be quiet. 2 years later, it was the Spring Dance Festival. I was 10. The entire auditorium felt damp with the smell of popcorn and perfume. Sarah was on stage, a tiny figure in a white dress and pink ribbons, doing a routine I'd watched her practice for months. When she finished, the applause was a storm. My dad shot up from his seat, clapping so hard his hands were red. When she ran off stage, he caught her and lifted her high into the air, spinning her around. I could hear his voice boom over the crowd. "That's my girl!" A week later, I came home from the district science fair. The school bus smelled like diesel and old vinyl. I was clutching a first-place blue ribbon. I'd spent 6 weeks in the garage building a solar car out of my dad's scrap wood and some foil from the kitchen. It actually ran. I found him in the living room, sitting in his armchair, the blue light of the evening news flickering across his face. The sound of the TV filled the room. I stood there for a full minute before he finally looked over. "Hey Dad, I won." I held out the ribbon. It was bright blue, with gold lettering. It felt so important on the bus. Now, in the dim light of the living room, it just looked like a piece of cloth. He glanced at it. He didn't take it. He didn't stand up. "That's nice," he said. Then he turned back to the TV. "Just don't stay up so late in the garage next time. You're running up the electric bill." I stood there, holding that ribbon, until my arm went numb. I felt the light inside me just click off. I quietly went to my room, shut the door, and put the solar car in the back of my closet. I never showed him the ribbon again. It wasn't cruelty, not really. It was a kind of steady, casual forgetting, an absence of light. And I learned, very early, that if you want to be seen, you can't wait for them to turn the light on. You have to find your own. By the time I was 12, I had perfected the art of silence. I learned that my achievements were quiet, and their celebrations were loud. When Sarah made the cheerleading squad, the house exploded. There were balloons tied to the mailbox, a congratulations banner in the dining room, and dinners out 3 nights in a row. My dad bought her brand new, white-soled shoes that squeaked on the kitchen tile. My mom, Helen, spent an entire weekend sewing sequins onto her uniform. The whole house vibrated with Sarah's success. That same spring, I got a letter. It was thick, on heavy cardstock. I'd passed the entrance exam for the state's advanced art program, a summer intensive I'd spent months building a portfolio for. I found my mom in the kitchen, on the phone, scheduling Sarah's hair appointment for the pep rally. I waited, holding the letter. When she finally hung up, she sighed. "What is it, Maya? I'm swamped." I handed her the letter. She scanned it, her eyes moving quickly over the words. "Oh," she said. She handed it back to me. "That's ambitious." I waited for a congratulations. I waited for her to look at me. Instead, she turned back to the counter, grabbing her car keys. "Listen," she said, her voice already half out the door. "That's great. But right now, I need you to be a team player. Your sister is failing English, and she has that big project due Monday. Can you just handle that? Remember to help Sarah with her English project later." She left. The screen door slammed shut, leaving me alone in the kitchen with the smell of her perfume and my acceptance letter. It was never one thing. It was this constant, steady erosion, this steady forgetting, as I called it in my notebooks. I wasn't the daughter. I was the assistant daughter, the support crew. The one who was always expected to be the structure, so Sarah could be the light. So, I found my own place. Behind our house, there was an old, dilapidated shed. It was leaning slightly to the left, and the door was warped from a decade of rain. But inside, it was mine. It smelled like cedar, damp earth, and the metallic tang of rust. Sunlight came in through the dirty, cracked windows, cutting beams of dust. I'd sit on the floor, surrounded by old tools, half-empty paint cans, and bags of concrete my dad had forgotten about. I found a stack of old boards, warped and gray with age. I started sanding them. I spent hours out there, just sanding. The rhythmic scrape of the paper against the wood, the feeling of the rough grain turning smooth under my hands. My arms would ache, my fingers would be raw, but my mind would finally go quiet. I wasn't an assistant. I wasn't a sister. I was just a pair of hands. I decided to build something, a small table. It was the ugliest thing you've ever seen. The legs were uneven, the top was tilted. I put it together with rusty nails I'd found in a coffee can. But when I was done, I stood back. It stood. I ran my hand across the rough wood. I felt the splinters, the uneven joints, the dent where I'd missed the nail. It was flawed, and it was solid. And I had a thought, so clear it felt like a bell ringing in the quiet shed. This is mine. It was the first thing in my life that I had made, from start to finish, that no one else had asked for, and no one else could take credit for. That table became my anchor. When I left for college on a full scholarship, another achievement that was met with a simple, "Oh good," I packed my life into 2 suitcases and 3 cardboard boxes. As I was taping up the last box, my dad came into my room. "You're not taking that thing, are you?" he asked, pointing at the table. I dragged it out of the shed. It was still ugly, still uneven. "It's the only thing I'm taking," I said. My mom, Helen, just sighed. "Maya, don't be dramatic. There's no room for it." She was more worried about the family photos on the wall, making sure I'd remember what home looks like. I left the photos. I took the table. I remember the splinters I got, carrying it up 3 flights of stairs to my first dorm room. It barely fit through the door. My new roommate looked at it like it was a piece of firewood. But I wedged it into the corner, and that was that. Over the years, that table was everything. I refinished it, sanding it down properly this time, staining it a dark walnut, bracing the wobbly leg with a piece of metal I found in the art department's scrap bin. It was my desk. It was my sculpting surface, bearing the scars of clay, wire, and plaster. It was the prototype table where I laid out the blueprints for my first kiln. When I finally saved enough to rent a small garage space and start my own studio, that table was the first thing I moved in. It was the only piece of home I'd ever known. My mother loved to say that Sarah was the heart of the family, the one who brought the life, the laughter, the drama, the one everyone orbited around. Maybe she was, but if Sarah was the heart, I was the structure. I was the foundation, the load-bearing walls, the beams in the ceiling that no one ever looks at. The things you only notice when they're gone. The things you depend on to be quiet, to be strong, to just hold everything up without ever asking for a single word of thanks. And I was tired of it. I stopped asking for recognition. I stopped waiting for them to see the blue ribbon, or the acceptance letter, or the scholarship. I stopped trying to get a seat at their table. I just started building it, building my art, building my reputation, building that studio from the ground up with my own 2 hands covered in clay and paint. Which brings me back to that Thursday. I was standing in my studio, the one I'd built, the one that was about to be on the cover of a magazine. The long, beautiful oak table was set for 15, and I was waiting for them to finally see what I had built. My phone buzzed. I wiped a streak of glaze off the screen with my thumb. "We'll skip it, your sister just moved too." I read the text once, then a second time. All those years. The Christmases. The science fair. The English projects. The shed. It all just compressed into those 12 words. Your sister just moved too. Even my greatest achievement was just an inconvenient footnote to her minor life event. I looked at the text. The reflection of the studio's track lighting shimmered on the dark screen. The whole space was silent, except for the faint hum of the kiln cooling in the next room. The air smelled of fresh paint, raw clay, and the faint, sharp scent of ozone. My thumb hovered over the keyboard. I thought of 1,000 things to say, years of anger, of frustration. Instead, I just typed 2 words. "That's okay." I pressed send. Then I set the phone face down on the counter. I stood there in the silence, my text sent, the phone still warm in my hand. I looked at the table, the long, polished oak table I had designed and helped build. It stretched down the center of the studio, the grain glowing under the track lights. 15 chairs. Each one an identical, perfect pool of light. I'd designed it specifically. No head seat. A circle, just stretched long. A table where everyone was equal. And in that moment, something inside me didn't break. It set. It was the feeling of clay in the kiln, hitting the exact temperature where it turns from soft mud to permanent stone. The pain was still there, a dull ache, but it wasn't in charge anymore. I wasn't angry. I was awake. For my entire life, I had been trying to earn a seat at a table that was never meant for me. I'd been begging for scraps of their attention, waiting for them to finally look up and see me. And with one casual text, they had confirmed it would never, ever happen. I let out a breath I'd been holding since I was 8 years old. I walked over to the reception desk. I took my phone, the one buzzing with a polite read receipt, and I pressed the side button. I held it down until the screen went black. A complete, final darkness. I opened the drawer under the counter, the one where I kept the folders for the studio. I pulled out the file labeled Guest List, the one with their names at the top. I dropped the dead phone into the drawer and slid it shut. The soft thud of the wood closing felt like a gavel. This was a boundary, not a wall to keep them out, but a line to keep me in. I was done. I went to my workbench and picked up my leather-bound notebook, the one with the cracked spine, the one that held every sketch, every formula for a glaze, every idea I'd ever had. I opened it to a fresh page. With a graphite pencil, I drew a single, dark line straight down the middle. On one side, I wrote "Those who always have a seat." I left it blank. On the other side, I wrote "Those who never do." And my hand, steady now, began to write. Rachel, my best friend from college, who ate Thanksgiving in the dorm cafeteria with me for 2 years straight because her family didn't do holidays. Eli, my cousin, the one they stopped inviting to reunions after he came out, the one they talked about in whispers. Aunt Marianne, my dad's sister, who talked too loud and took up too much space, the one my mom always sat in the kitchen to help, so she wouldn't bother the main table. Grandfather Elias, my mom's own father, who they'd put in a home and visited twice a year because he told uncomfortable truths. The list filled the page. All the quiet, practical people. The ones who, like me, were treated as structural. The beams, the forgotten. I looked at the names, and then I looked at the 15 empty chairs. I picked up my pencil. I wasn't waiting to be invited anymore. I was setting the table. I didn't sleep. At 2 a.m., the studio was silent, bathed in the cold blue light of the street lamps. I walked over to the long oak table, the one they had rejected, and I rolled out a huge sheet of tracing paper. The sound echoed in the empty room. I wasn't a ceramicist anymore. I was an architect. I picked up a pencil and began to draw a blueprint, not for a building, but for a single night. I drew the table, the chairs, the path from the door. I drew lines for light sources, for temperature, for the flow of movement. At the very top of the page, I wrote in firm block letters, "Everyone has a seat." This wasn't a party. It was a structural revision. The plan was simple. No head of the table, equal sight lines for everyone. The lighting would be low and warm, hitting the center of the table, not the faces of the guests, so no one felt on display. The music would be just loud enough to cover the silence, but low enough that Aunt Marianne wouldn't have to shout. It would be a floor plan for belonging. The next morning, I opened my laptop and started sending messages. Short, direct, "Dinner this Saturday, my studio, 7 p.m., come hungry." Then I started making the calls. The hard ones. The names on my forgotten list. I called Rachel first. Her voice was hesitant. "Maya? You're hosting? On a Saturday?" "It's time," I said. A pause. Then warmth, flooding the line. "I'll bring the kids." I called Eli. "A dinner? Like, a family dinner?" "A better one," I said. I heard him smile. "Count me in." I called my grandfather, Elias. His voice was rough. "You built a studio?" "Well, hell. Of course I'll come. Someone's got to." The work began. I moved with a precision I usually saved for a kiln firing. I was a whirlwind of checklists. I ticked boxes, I paid invoices, I ordered flowers. The studio was alive, not with tension, but with motion. At the pottery supply store, picking up a bulk order of small terracotta pots for party favors, the clerk looked at the order. "Big party?" he asked, loading the box. I paused, my hand on the dusty clay. "Something like that," I said. He smiled, not knowing he was handing me the materials for a small revolution. That evening, Margaret, the local chef I'd hired, arrived. She was a woman in her 50s with flour in her hair and calm, steady eyes. She looked around the studio, at the kilns in the corner, at the huge, empty table. "This is a beautiful space," she said, unpacking ingredients. "What kind of dinner is this, exactly?" I stopped adjusting a centerpiece. I looked at her, and the truth just came out. Simple, solid, and clean. "It's a table," I said, my voice quiet, "for people who stopped being invited." Margaret stopped. She looked at me, really looked at me, and a slow, deep smile spread across her face. The kind of smile that says, "I know exactly what you mean." She nodded once. "Then we'd better make them one hell of a meal." The next 2 days were choreography. Lights were strung, wildflowers were arranged, and on Saturday afternoon, hours before the guests arrived, I did the last thing. I took out 15 thick, cream-colored cards. And on each one, in my clearest script, I wrote 3 simple words. "You belong here." On Friday evening, the magazine crew arrived. They were early, catching the golden hour light as it streamed through the studio's tall windows. I was just placing the last "You belong here" card on the table. The photographer, a quiet woman with kind eyes, just nodded. "Keep going," she said. "Pretend we're not here." So I did. And they filmed everything. They filmed the long oak table, set for 15. They filmed the kilns in the corner, silent and waiting. They filmed my hands, brushing dust from a finished vase. They filmed the empty chairs, the stacks of plates, and the soft, warm light I'd designed to make everyone feel safe. They were, without knowing it, documenting the evidence. The next night, the studio was full. The first headlights wound up the hill, cutting through the dusk. I opened the door, and the sound I'd been waiting for washed in. Laughter. Rachel's kids ran past me, smelling like suburban lawns and sugar. Aunt Marianne bustled in, clutching a massive, foil-wrapped pie that smelled of apples and cinnamon. "I know you've got a chef," she boomed, "but Margaret's is not my grandmother's." Eli and his partner, grandfather Elias, grumbling about the cold, a wave of forgotten friends and cousins, all arriving, all looking around with a kind of hesitant wonder. This time, I lit the candles. The flames stood tall, reflecting in the windows. I watched Margaret place the last dish: salmon, thyme, roasted vegetables. When the last guest was inside, I closed the studio door. The sound of the latch clicking shut was a period on a sentence. I looked at the table. All 15 chairs were full. The sound was a low, warm hum of conversation and clinking forks. I took my seat, halfway down, right between Elias and Rachel. Not at the head, not at the foot, just a part of the whole. It was the first meal I'd ever had where I wasn't starving. And as I looked at the faces, lit by the candles I'd lit for them, I had one sharp, final thought. It wasn't that my family was missing, it was that every chair was finally full. The lifestyle magazine hit the stands the following week. I bought 10 copies. We were on the terrace, the found family: Rachel, Eli, Aunt Marianne, and Elias reading it aloud like a script. The article was titled, "The Studio That Built a Community." They'd used the photos of the table, the chairs, the food. They'd interviewed Margaret. And then, Rachel read the main quote. When Maya built this space, she read, her voice shaking just a little, she wanted to create a place where everyone, truly everyone, had a seat at the table. Elias grunted. She got that right. Wait, Rachel said, her finger tracing the page. They quote you. Maya, they quote you. She cleared her throat. In this studio, balance isn't decorative, Maya says. It's structural. Rachel looked up from the page, her eyes wide. My God, Maya, she whispered. You actually said that? I just smiled. And that's when my phone, which I'd finally turned back on and left on the workbench, began to vibrate. It wasn't a single buzz. It was a frantic, non-stop seizure. The screen lit up, a frantic blue-white against the dark clay. I picked it up. 32 missed calls. Mom, Helen, Dad, Sarah, Mom, Sarah. Then the texts, flooding in, one after another, a cascade of panic. We saw the article. Why didn't you tell us? Everyone is calling us. You embarrassed us. You need to call me back. Now. The phone was buzzing so hard it was vibrating off the workbench. I looked at the screen, at my mother's name, flashing, demanding. I pressed the silence button. And I let it ring. My phone was silent, but the house wasn't. A day later, my grandfather, Elias, called. I answered. His voice was rough, like old sandpaper. Saw the article, he grunted. Good photos. Thanks, Grandpa. They're screaming, you know, he said. No preamble, your mother's side. Ruffled their feathers good. I know. Listen to me, he said, his voice dropping. They're gonna try to rewrite it. They'll tell you it was a misunderstanding. They'll say you're too sensitive. They'll try to make you apologize for their bad behavior. I looked out the studio window at the ocean. What do I do? Nothing, he said. You don't argue. You don't explain. You just let the truth sit in the open. It's stronger there. It'll do the work for you. An hour later, as if on cue, my phone rang. Mom, Helen. Elias was still at the studio. He'd come by to inspect the kiln. He was sitting at the oak table, drinking tea I'd made him. He saw the name on the screen and nodded, a silent, go on. I answered. I put it on speakerphone. The sound of my mother's voice filled the studio. It was falsely gentle, the voice she used when she was trying to prove she was the reasonable one. Maya? Honey. We saw your article. It's lovely, but I think there's been a huge misunderstanding. I waited. I said nothing. They made it sound like we excluded you. That isn't true, and you know it. We've always supported your projects. Your sister was moving, Maya. You know how busy things get. You're overreacting again. Before I could even think of a reply, Elias's voice cut through the air, sharp and clear. Helen, stop. The silence on the line was absolute. Dad? Helen's voice was suddenly small. I said, stop, Elias said, leaning toward the phone. I've watched you do this since she was a child. I've watched you turn the light away from her and point it at Sarah. Every Christmas. Every birthday. Every time this girl built something, you asked her to hold a hammer for her sister. Dad, this isn't the time. This is a family matter. It's the only time, he snapped. You built your entire house around Sarah's comfort, and you told yourself it was fairness. It wasn't. It was favoritism. And now, the whole town has seen it for what it is. And you're not mad she's hurt. You're mad you got caught. I heard my mother's sharp inhale. I could hear my father muttering unbelievable in the background. Then, a click. She'd hung up. My hand was shaking. Elias looked at me over his teacup, his eyes clear. "You see," he said, his voice gentle now. "You didn't need to win. You just needed to stop carrying it." 2 days later, the studio was quiet again. I'd left my phone off. The chairs were all pushed in. The kiln was cooling. I opened the big terrace doors and let the wind off the ocean move through the space. It smelled like salt and cold clay. I stood in the center of the room, barefoot on the concrete, and I just breathed. This was it, the first moment of peace. The silence wasn't empty. It was full. That evening, I invited only 3 people back. My parents and Sarah. No cameras, no guests, no table for 15. I took them to the back room of the studio, the small office where I did my sketches, and in the center, I'd placed the table. The small, ugly, uneven cedar table I'd built in the shed when I was 12. Its surface was scarred with paint and clay, a map of my entire life. I set 4 plates. I poured water, and I waited. When they arrived, they looked smaller. The anger was gone, replaced by a strained, hollow quiet. My mother ran her fingers along the edge of the old, scarred wood. "I remember this," she whispered. "It's home," I said simply. Dinner was quiet. The wind rattled the windows. My father complimented the food. And then Sarah, who hadn't looked at me once, spoke. Her voice was a thread. "I didn't know," she said, staring at the wood grain. I didn't know it hurt that much. I just thought, that's just how it was." I nodded. I didn't know how to say it. No one apologized, not really. But the silence between us wasn't war anymore. It was just space. As they were leaving, my mother, Helen, paused at the door. She looked back at me, standing next to my table. "You did good, Maya," she said. Her voice was quiet. "Really good." It wasn't redemption. It wasn't a perfect ending. But it was recognition. And after a lifetime of invisibility, that was enough. After they left, I stayed on the terrace, my hand resting on the old cedar table. The night air was cold, but the wood felt warm. For 30 years, I had waited for them to open a chair for me. And I finally realized, you don't have to wait for a seat when you know how to build the whole table yourself. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, this story was for you. Sometimes silence isn't weakness, it's design, it's structure, and sometimes the sharpest boundary is just setting a new table and choosing, finally, who gets to sit there. Tell me in the comments. Have you ever had to set a boundary so sharp it changed everything? I read every story you share. It's how this community stays real. And if you want more stories about justice and the quiet ways we rebuild, subscribe. There's always another story waiting to be told.